It was a sunlit afternoon when Gertrude and Charles Stevenson made their way to St. Juliana's School for Disabled Children, the kind of place that seemed to radiate quiet compassion even from the outside. The school stood nestled in a calm residential corridor, its brick facade softened by ivy and framed by bursts of marigolds and lavender that spilled from the neat borders of its walkway. As the couple parked the car, a hush settled between them, a silence heavy not with words left unsaid, but with the weight of what this day meant. Their task, in essence, was simple: to collect their granddaughter from school, yet beneath that simplicity pulsed a sorrow they could not name. Gertrude, well into her 70s, yet still brisk in movement and mind, adjusted her scarf as she stepped out into the sharp autumn light. Charles, her husband, of more than half a century, moved with a slower, deliberate rhythm, the years having carved their gentle toll upon his body in the form of rounded shoulders and a faint stoop. Once, the two of them had imagined that their lives would quiet with age, that they would drift into a peaceful routine of mornings in the garden and evenings with books and tea. Instead, life had turned back upon itself, returning them to a kind of parenthood they had not anticipated. Fred, their only son, had become a devoted police officer, steadfast and unyielding in his work. Yet the events of the past days had left him undone. Now it fell upon them, old bones and trembling hearts, to care for the child who had known more turmoil in 7 years than most adults endure in a lifetime. That morning, Fred had called. His voice, though steady, carried a fracture beneath it, the sound of a man gripping at composure while the ground shifted beneath him. "Pick up Kai at noon," he had said, each word thick with strain, the kind that only a father's desperation could conjure. Gertrude had not asked questions. She had only caught the tremor in his voice and known, instinctively, that something irrevocable had happened. Later, she and Charles heard the rest on the news, about the arrest, the chaos, the name of the woman they had once met only in passing, but who had filled Fred's life, and now, it seemed, his heart, with grief. As they entered through the arched doorway of St. Juliana's, the faint scent of disinfectant mingled with crayons and warm paper, the familiar perfume of a place meant for children. The sound of laughter drifted faintly down the hall, though it seemed subdued today, as if the air itself carried an awareness of what awaited them. Gertrude's chest tightened. She had met Kai only a few times, brief visits, small moments folded into the periphery of a busy life, but the child had lingered in her memory. Those wide, cerulean eyes, clear as glass, and the silent grace with which she moved through the world had left a mark. She had inherited her father's delicacy of feature, but her mother's quiet intensity. The world, loud and unrelenting, had always been too much for her, and she had found her peace in silence, in the measured rhythm of her hands, and in the calm she carried like a secret language. When they reached the classroom, the teacher, a soft-spoken woman with gentle eyes magnified by wire-rimmed glasses, greeted them with a nod that carried both understanding and sympathy. "She's just finishing her drawing," she said quietly, before walking over to where the girl sat, bent over a page of bright, uneven color. The room was filled with children's artwork, rainbows, trees, uneven scrawls of joy and effort pinned along the walls. There was warmth here, the kind that spoke of safety and order. Yet beneath that warmth, Gertrude could feel an undercurrent of tension, a tremor of something about to shift. When Kai appeared in the doorway, her small frame by the soft light spilling from the windows, Gertrude felt her breath catch. The child's uniform hung a little loose on her hair neatly combed, her expression a one of quiet confusion. For a moment, she simply stood there, hands moving uncertainly, her blue eyes flickering from the teacher to the two people waiting for her. She knew them, but not enough to feel at ease. The familiarity was faint, a fragile thread stretched across time and distance. Then her eyes widened slightly, recognition dawning, though it was quickly followed by hesitation. Kai's small hands began to move, quick and anxious. "Mama, Daddy," she signed, the signs trembling through her fingers, her face drawn with uncertainty. The word struck Gertrude like a blow. She knelt slowly, the ache in her knees forgotten beneath the weight of the child's gaze. "We're here to take you home, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice gentle, though she knew Kai could not hear. The words were for both of them, a fragile bridge between two worlds, sound and silence, understanding and hope. Kai's hands fluttered again, urgent, pleading. "Mama, Daddy." Charles stepped forward, his voice low and careful, the cadence of an old man trying not to startle something delicate. "Your daddy sent us to get you, love. He asked us to bring you home. You'll stay with us for a little while." The child's expression faltered, her fingers stilled. For a moment she simply looked at them, eyes clouded with confusion, her breath quick and shallow. Gertrude could see the effort it took for her to make sense of words she could not hear, to fit this new reality into her small, structured world. The teacher moved closer then, crouching beside her. "Kai," she said softly, her signs deliberate and tender. "These are your grandparents, Grandma Gertrude and Grandpa Charles. They're going to take care of you until your mama and daddy can come for you." The explanation did not erase the fear in the child's face, but something in her posture began to soften. Gertrude reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed a stray lock of hair from Kai's forehead. She tried to sign back, the movement slow, uncertain, a clumsy mimicry of the language her granddaughter knew so fluently. "Safe," she signed, her voice breaking as she added aloud. "You're safe, sweetheart." Kai's eyes followed her hands, and though she did not fully understand, she seemed to sense the intent. Her body relaxed fractionally, her shoulders lowering. She still looked small and lost, but a faint glimmer of trust flickered there, like the first hint of dawn through fog. While Gertrude helped her pack, folding papers, tucking crayons into a small worn case, Charles spoke quietly with the teacher near the doorway. His tone was low, his expression solemn. "Fred asked us to take her," he said. "He's dealing with, well, with more than one man should have to." The teacher nodded. "She's a sensitive child," she murmured. "She'll need patience, especially with all this change." When everything was ready, Gertrude held out her hand. "All right, darling," she said softly. "Let's go home." Kai stood very still, clutching the strap of her small backpack. Her fingers moved one final time, hesitant and trembling. "Mama, Daddy." Charles's throat tightened. He bent down so that he was level with her, the old bones in his knees creaking, and he smiled, an old, tired, hopeful smile. "We'll take good care of you, Kai," he said quietly. "I promise." The child hesitated, then took Gertrude's hand. The warmth of her small palm against the older woman's skin was enough to make Gertrude's eyes sting. Together, they walked out into the light, the three of them, a fragile new constellation, bound by love, by duty, and by the silent understanding that sometimes family begins in the hardest of places. The old sedan, battered by years of service, yet still reliable beneath Charles's patient care, rumbled to life with a shudder and a sigh. The sound filled the quiet as the small family settled into their seats, the interior thick with the faint scent of worn leather and lingering traces of engine oil. Gertrude sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she glanced back at Kai, who sat small and silent in the back seat, her legs drawn close, her little hands resting uncertainly in her lap. The child's blue eyes were wide and watchful, her delicate face clouded by confusion. Charles's hands were steady on the wheel, though inside him an anxious rhythm kept beating, a tide of thoughts that refused to settle. He had lived long enough to see the world turn cruel and kind in equal measure, but never had he faced something that felt so tenderly impossible as this drive with the granddaughter he barely knew. There was a helplessness in the situation, a sense that he was steering them through more than just city streets, that the road itself carried them towards something neither of them could yet name. He tried, for Kai's sake, to summon lightness into his voice as he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "You like card games, Kai?" he asked softly, his words soft but hopeful. The child's gaze flickered toward him, her hands twitching in her lap, though no sound came. She was reading his lips, perhaps, or maybe simply watching the shape of his mouth in the rearview mirror and trying to piece meaning from rhythm and movement. "How about we play a game when we get home, He tried again, the corners of his mouth lifting into the kind of smile that had once reassured his own son. Gertrude turned slightly, her expression warm but shadowed by quiet worry. "Don't you worry, sweetheart," she said, her voice low and tender, though she knew the child could not hear the tone she worked so carefully to keep steady. "We'll make sure everything's all right." Kai pressed her forehead lightly against the cool window, her breath fogging the glass, tracing with her eyes the passing shapes of trees and buildings. She did not cry, and that quiet restraint made Gertrude's chest ache in a way words could not describe. When they finally reached Fred's house, the familiar sight of the small two-story home brought with it a faint ache of memory. To Charles and Gertrude, this had always been their son's refuge, a place of order and modest comfort, where family dinners had been shared and laughter had once filled the rooms. Today, though, it seemed changed, heavy with an absence that pressed upon the walls. It would serve, for now, as a sanctuary, a fragile one, for the three of them. Charles parked the car with care, cutting the engine and letting the silence fall again. He stepped out, his knees protesting, and opened the back door for Kai. She looked up at him uncertainly before allowing him to help her down. Gertrude reached for her small hand, offering a reassuring squeeze, and together they walked up the gravel path, the soft crunch beneath their shoes sounding far louder than it should have. Inside was still faintly scented with the lingering trace of soap and old wood polish. Gertrude moved instinctively toward the kitchen, as if motion alone could keep despair at bay. "All right, let's get some lunch ready," she said, her voice steady but distant, as she tied on an apron and began to move about with quiet purpose. The rhythm of her work, the chopping of vegetables, the soft hiss of food meeting oil in the pan, the rattle of crockery, brought a small measure of calm. She had always found refuge in the simple act of feeding people. It was her way of restoring order when everything else fell apart. In the living room, Charles placed a deck of cards on the low glass table and began to shuffle. The sound was crisp, familiar, comforting in its own small way. "Do you ever play solitaire, Kai?" he asked, his voice gentle as he laid out the cards. Kai watched him, her small face drawn in concentration, her fingers moving hesitantly. "What's this?" she sighed, her motions slow, her hands trembling slightly, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing, even in silence. Charles smiled, a soft, tired curve of the mouth that reached his eyes. "It's just a game," he said, miming the action of placing cards down, hoping she would follow. He dealt carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, the way one might speak in a foreign language, careful not to break the fragile connection. Kai's eyes followed his every motion. After a long pause, she pulled out a card from the pile and set it down, tentative but curious. It was the smallest thing, yet to Charles, it felt monumental, a sliver of hope taking root. The smell of cooking drifted in from the kitchen, onions softening in oil, and the comforting scent of soup simmering low. When Gertrude called out that lunch was ready, her voice carried with it a warmth she did not entirely feel. "Come on, Kai," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "Let's eat something to fill our bellies." They gathered around a small table, the three of them dwarfed by the quietness of the house. Kai sat between her grandparents, picking at her food, her eyes flickering between them. She seemed both present and far away, as though her mind hovered somewhere she could not name. Gertrude watched her closely, the maternal instinct in her rising with each small motion of the child's hands. Fred's daughter, she thought, and Anya's too. A part of both of them, and yet her own fragile being, caught in the middle of something too vast for her small shoulders to bear. They ate in silence, the occasional clink of cutlery filling the gaps where words could not. When Kai looked up, Gertrude smiled gently and said, "You're safe here, dear. This is your daddy's house." The words were soft, carried on the rhythm of care and quiet insistence, and though Kai could not hear them, something in Gertrude's tone, in the kindness of her eyes, seemed to reach her. When the dishes were cleared and the house settled again into its muted calm, Gertrude stood by the kitchen counter, her hands still damp from washing up. The afternoon light fell pale and slanted through the curtains, touching the fine lines on her face, and she felt the weight of years settle upon her shoulders. She reached for her phone and dialed Fred's number, her heart tightening as it rang. "Hello, Mom," Fred's voice came through after the second ring, rough-edged with exhaustion. "Fred," she said softly, "I just wanted to let you know I'll be picking up Matilda from school today." There was a pause, and then a faint sigh. "Thanks. I'm glad you're doing that. How's Kai? Is she doing okay?" Gertrude glanced toward the living room, where Kai sat quietly, folding cards into little towers, her face intent and solemn. "She's doing fine, dear," she said, forcing a note of calm into her voice. "Don't worry about her. We're looking after her." She hesitated then, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Fred, how's Anya? We saw the news. Is there any progress with her situation?" There was a long silence, broken only by the faint hum of the line. When Fred finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost a whisper. "I can't talk about it right now," he said. "I just can't." Gertrude closed her eyes, the ache in her chest deepening. She could hear the helplessness in his voice, the raw struggle of a man torn between duty and love. "All right, son," she said quietly. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself." When the call ended, she stood for a long time in the quiet kitchen, the faint murmur of Kai's movements in the other room, the only sound in the house. The walk was peaceful enough, though Gertrude could not escape the tension knotted deep within her chest, a quiet pressure that pulsed with every step she took along the London pavement. She tried to convince herself that everything would settle in time, that the turbulence circling her family would calm, yet a quiet dread threaded through her thoughts, whispering that something far greater than any of them was slowly unfolding. Still, she kept her shoulders straight, her steps steady, and her expression gentle. The children needed her to be the calm in all of this. When she arrived at Matilda's school, she paused by the gate, taking a slow breath before entering the grounds. The small red brick building was alive with the easy noise of childhood, the laughter and shouts of children spilling from classrooms, the squeak of shoes against linoleum, the rush of voices calling goodbyes. It was a sound both ordinary and reassuring, the rhythm of a world untouched by the weight that pressed on her own. She scanned the crowd until her eyes found Matilda, standing near the entrance with her backpack slung loosely over one shoulder, her golden curls bouncing as she shifted her weight impatiently. Matilda was Fred's daughter, his child with his late wife Rosalie, and every time Gertrude saw her, she felt that familiar ache of remembrance. The child carried echoes of both her parents, the quick, curious eyes that mirrored Fred's, and the cascade of golden, curly hair that had been Rosalie's. There were moments when Gertrude would catch Matilda turning her head in a certain way or smiling with a particular tilt of her mouth, and the resemblance would strike her with almost unbearable clarity. Yet it was a tender ache, the kind that softened rather than broke. "Hello, darling," Gertrude called, her voice touched with warmth. Matilda turned, her eyes lighting up as recognition dawned. "Grandma," she cried, running forward with her arms outstretched. Gertrude bent down just in time to catch her, the small body colliding with her own in a flurry of affection. For a moment, she simply held the child close, breathing in the faint scent of shampoo and chalk dust, the scent of school days and innocence. The tightness in her chest eased just slightly. "How's my girl today?" she asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from Matilda's forehead. "I'm good, Grandma. We learned about animals today, and I saw a picture of a giraffe." The child's eyes were bright, her excitement bubbling over in a way that felt contagious. Gertrude smiled. "That sounds wonderful. Come along then. Your grandpa's waiting at home, and we've got some company." Matilda tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Company?" "Yes, dear. Your sister Kai is staying with us for a little while. You'll get to see her." The name seemed to ignite something inside the girl. "Kai's here?" she asked, her voice lifting with surprise and delight. Gertrude nodded, her tone gentle. "She is. Your father thought it best that you all be together for now." They walked hand in hand out of the school gates, Matilda's small fingers warm in hers, the conversation drifting from lessons and classmates to the prospect of seeing her sister again. Gertrude listened with quiet affection, her heart swelling as she watched the life and spirit radiating from the child beside her. It was a fragile moment of happiness, a fleeting reprieve from the unease that had shadowed their days. When they arrived home, inside the house carried the faint scent of cooked vegetables and the comforting hum of domestic quiet. The soft click of playing cards reached them from the living room, and as they stepped inside, Gertrude saw Kai sitting cross-legged on the rug, her small frame bent in concentration over the spread of cards that Charles had laid out earlier. Matilda's eyes widened when she saw her half-sister. "Kai!" she exclaimed, and before Gertrude could say a word, she darted across the room. Kai looked up at the sudden movement, her face transforming from confusion to recognition in an instant. Then the two girls collided in an embrace so fierce and pure that Gertrude felt her throat tighten. They clung to each other, laughing in that high, unguarded way only children can, their small arms locked, their giggles echoing through the room like a song of reunion. Charles, seated at the kitchen table, lifted his gaze from the newspaper and smiled faintly, while Gertrude lingered in the doorway, watching the two of them as though she might hold the moment still by the strength of her gaze alone. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the house seemed to breathe again. The laughter that rose from the floorboards loosened something heavy inside her, and for one precious heartbeat, the world outside ceased to matter. The girls soon found themselves on the carpet, surrounded by a scatter of cards. The game itself was barely a game at all, full of made-up rules and spontaneous bursts of laughter. Matilda tried to explain how to match colors and suits, her words tumbling out between giggles, while Kai, hesitant at first, began to mimic her gestures. Her blue eyes sparkled with the effort, and each time she managed to place a card correctly, Matilda erupted in applause, as if it were a victory worth celebrating. "You did it," Matilda cheered, handing Kai a new card with exaggerated ceremony. Kai's fingers moved clumsily as she signed a small question, her expression earnest and bright. "What's this?" she asked with her hands, her movements halting but full of intent. Matilda tilted her head, not entirely sure of Kai's meaning, but she pointed at the cards and grinned. "It's a game. We match them, red with red, blue with blue. See?" She laid down 2 matching cards with a flourish, and Kai, eyes wide, nodded in comprehension. The rhythm of their play settled into something soft and hypnotic, the sound of shuffling cards mingling with bursts of laughter. Gertrude leaned lightly against the doorframe, her hands folded before her, and Charles stood beside her, his expression gentled by the sight. The two of them exchanged a quiet glance, one of shared relief. "They're getting along well," Gertrude murmured, her voice low and full of tenderness. Charles nodded, his weathered face softening. "They are. It's good to see them finding comfort in each other. For all that's happened, they deserve a bit of peace." Gertrude's lips pressed together in a faint smile. She knew the peace was fragile, that beyond these walls, a storm still waited, heavy and unrelenting. But within this small room, for now, the only thing that mattered was the soft laughter of 2 children discovering one another anew. Matilda made a silly face, her curls bouncing as she scrunched her nose, and Kai burst into a fit of giggles so bright and unrestrained that even Charles chuckled quietly under his breath. They were no longer 2 halves of separate lives, but 2 sisters, connected not by words or explanations, but by the simple truth of shared joy. As the game stretched on, Kai laid a card down with the exaggerated satisfaction of someone who had finally mastered a secret. Matilda grinned and leaned closer, her eyes alight. "You're getting really good at this, Kai," she said proudly. Kai smiled, her lips parting in that shy, radiant way that always made Gertrude's heart ache. Her fingers moved carefully as she signed, "Thank you." Matilda didn't know every sign, but she understood enough. She beamed, nodding with the quiet certainty of love. The cards between them became less a game and more a bridge, something wordless and whole, something that promised connection even when the rest of the world felt divided. From the doorway, Gertrude felt her eyes grow warm. She thought of Fred, of Anya, of all the questions that waited beyond this fragile peace. But then Kai laughed again, a sound bright and free, and Matilda joined her, and Gertrude let herself breathe. The house had fallen into a deep and solemn quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to breathe on its own. It was interrupted only by the faint creak of the old wooden floors, the whisper of the night wind brushing against the windows, and the slow, steady tick of the clock in the hall. The warmth that had lingered through the evening now settled into a hush that should have felt comforting, but to Kai, it pressed heavily against her small frame, filling the space around her with something lonely and hollow. The stillness carried weight, and in that weight, she could feel the absence of everything she longed for. She had curled herself into Matilda's bed earlier that night, seeking the soft warmth of another body beside her, the faint smell of lavender from freshly washed sheets. Yet the comfort was fleeting. Her thoughts refused to still, racing through the empty corridors of memory, where her mother's face would appear for a moment before fading back into shadow. The ache in her chest deepened with every passing minute. It was not fear that kept her awake, but the terrible heaviness of longing, the vast, unfillable space left by her parents' absence. When she could no longer lie still, Kai pushed the blanket aside and swung her legs carefully over the edge of the bed. Her bare feet touched the wooden floor, cool and smooth beneath her skin. The sound of her movement was barely a whisper, yet in the silence of the house, it felt enormous. She paused, her small body tense. She moved down the hallway, her fingertips grazing the wall for balance. The shadows seemed alive in the faint light that spilled from a half-open curtain, stretching and shifting along the walls like soft, restless ghosts. The air was tinged with the scent of old wood and the faint trace of her grandmother's rosewater soap, and though it was familiar, it did little to ease the sense of strangeness that filled her. Everything here was kind and warm, but it wasn't her home. Home was smaller, warmer, quieter in a different way. Home had her mama's voice. Even if she couldn't hear it, she knew its shape, the touch of her hand, the gentle rhythm of her fingers, signing words of comfort against the air. Kai found her way into the living room and climbed up onto the couch, pulling her knees close to her chest. The room felt too large without anyone in it. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast soft amber patterns through the curtains, and she followed them with her eyes as they rippled faintly across the walls. She stared out toward the night, her reflection faintly visible in the window pane, her pale face blurred by glass and shadow. The darkness outside seemed endless, the sky deep and still, and somewhere within it, she imagined her parents. She pictured her mama's face, the kind curve of her mouth when she smiled, and the warmth of her hands as they brushed back her hair. Her father's laugh followed in her mind, a laugh she could not hear but always felt, like the vibration against her skin. The memories pressed close, vivid and painful, until her chest felt too tight to contain them. Her eyes filled with tears before she even realized it, and she wiped at them quickly with the back of her hand, unwilling to let them fall. Her mother used to tell her that crying was not weakness, but tonight it felt like falling apart, and she couldn't afford that, not when she needed to be brave. Yet the loneliness swelled in her, like the tide, impossible to hold back. She thought of the way her mother would sit beside her bed, signing softly little messages of love that felt like light. You are safe. You are loved. You are mine. Those gestures had been her lullabies. The silence around her now was too big, too empty. She sniffled, rubbing her eyes again, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind refused to rest. Every thought circled back to the same questions, over and over. Where were they? Were they safe? Did they think of her the way she thought of them? Each question felt heavier than the one before, and the quiet offered no answers. Her small hands moved before she could stop them, her fingers shaping the words that filled her heart. I want Mama, she signed softly, watching the movements in the dim light. Her throat ached as she added, I want Daddy. She pressed her palms together and rested them against her forehead, closing her eyes as though she could will them both to appear through sheer need. Time blurred after that. The clock's slow rhythm became a lullaby of its own, the only heartbeat in the stillness. Her eyes grew heavy, yet her mind refused to let her rest. The shadows shifted across the floor as the night deepened, and she stayed there by the window, small and silent, watching for something that would not come. The weight of longing settled deeper into her chest until it became something she could almost feel in her bones, a dull ache that hummed softly in the dark. And still she waited, her gaze fixed on the night outside, as if at any moment the door might open and her parents would step through, reaching for her with open arms. But the only answer was the wind at the window, the sigh of the world asleep, and the quiet thrum of her own heart beating in time with the hope she refused to let go. The city streets lay still beneath a veil of darkness, their silence broken only by the soft hum of Fred Stevenson's patrol car as it came to a stop before the large house he called home. The night pressed close around him, heavy and airless, carrying with it the faint smell of rain on asphalt. His uniform felt heavier than it ever had before, clinging to him with the weight of a day that refused to release him from its grip. When he stepped out, the metallic click of the car doors seemed to echo through the quiet street. He ran a hand through his untidy auburn hair and drew a breath that caught, somewhere between weariness and dread, before he finally turned toward the house. Inside, the quiet was different. It was not peaceful, not the kind that soothes a man who has been running from chaos. It was a silence that pressed against the walls, thick and uneasy, the kind that makes every breath feel intrusive. The faint light spilling from the hallway gave the living room a muted, golden hue. Fred stood for a moment, letting his tired hazel eyes adjust to the dimness. Then he saw her. Kai sat curled up on the couch, her small frame tense, her fists clenched at her sides. Her blonde head was bowed, her shoulders drawn in, as though trying to make herself smaller, invisible. Even from across the room, Fred could see the stiffness in her posture, the quiet storm brewing beneath her stillness. It struck him in the chest, that fragile mix of anger and sadness that only a child could carry so purely. His throat tightened. He had spent years learning how to talk people down, how to diffuse fights with a half smile and an easy word. But those tools meant nothing here. None of them could reach her. He said her name softly, almost to himself, though he knew she couldn't hear it. The word slipped from his mouth like a sigh, a habit of the heart. Moving closer, he knelt beside the couch, close enough that she could see him if she chose to look. When she didn't, he hesitated for a moment before gently tapping the cushion beside her. Her eyes lifted slowly, blue and wet with tears, filled with a quiet fury that spoke of grief far too large for her small frame. Fred's mind went blank. The pages of notes he had filled with careful practice, the hours spent repeating signs in front of the mirror, all of it vanished beneath the weight of her real pain. She moved her hands quickly, signing something he couldn't follow. His stomach twisted as he struggled to piece together fragments of meaning, catching only a few shapes. Sad, alone. "I know," he whispered, though the sound was for him more than for her. His voice broke against the quiet. He wanted to tell her everything he couldn't sign, to promise her safety, to promise that things would be all right. But language failed him. So, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his notepad, flipping to a blank page. The pen felt heavy in his hand. "I don't know enough yet," he wrote carefully, "but I'm learning every day." Kai sniffled, her small fingers brushing across the words before she looked back up at him. Her lip trembled, her eyes softening, just enough for him to see the child beneath the anger. Then, hesitantly, she took the pen and wrote her reply, with messy, uneven strokes. "I miss my mama." Fred's chest constricted. The air felt thick in his lungs. He nodded, then wrote beneath her words, "I miss her too, but I promise I'm here for you." For a long moment, she stared at the words as though weighing their truth. Then her small fingers brushed against his hand, a fleeting, fragile touch that carried more meaning than anything written between them. It was brief, but it was enough. Fred's heart swelled, fierce and aching, as he looked at her and signed carefully, slowly, the one phrase he knew he could do without faltering. "I love you." Kai's eyes widened, surprise flickering across her face like the glint of light on water. Then, with a small tremor in her hands, she signed it back. Fred felt something inside him crack and heal all at once. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly, letting the warmth of her small body press against his chest. She trembled, her fingers clutching at his uniform, and he held her closer, breathing in the faint scent of her hair and the softness of her skin against his cheek. The silence between them shifted then. It became something tender, something whole. He didn't rush her. He knew that grief had its own rhythm, that no word or sign could undo what she had lost. When she finally pulled back, her eyes still glassy, but calmer, he offered her a small, reassuring smile. Taking the notepad again, he wrote gently, "Tell me what you need." She hesitated before writing her response, the pen trembling slightly in her grip. "I don't want to be alone." Fred's throat tightened as he read it. "You're not alone. I promise," he wrote beneath her words. Kai's gaze lingered on the page, her expression guarded, uncertain. Then she lifted her hands, signing one small word that carried the full weight of her heart. "Stay." He didn't hesitate. He sat beside her, his movements slow, deliberate, making sure she could see him and feel his presence in the quiet. He tapped the cushion between them, catching her eye before nodding back. She studied him, searching his face, then gave a tiny nod and leaned closer until her head rested against his arm. The tension in her body began to ease, her breathing even out as if, for the first time that night, she believed he might not disappear. When he lifted the notepad again, he scribbled, "Want to watch a movie?" Kai thought for a moment before nodding. She reached for the remote, her movements tentative, and paused just before turning on the TV. Then she looked at him, her blue eyes steady, and signed something that made his chest ache. "Thank you." Fred smiled softly and signed back, "Always." As the movie began to play, Kai shifted, crawling onto his lap and curling against him as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Her fingers found his shirt again, clutching lightly, her head resting against his chest. Fred's arms folded around her instinctively. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head and closed his eyes, feeling the small, steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Minutes passed before she reached for the notepad again, her movements slow, hesitant. When she finally turned it toward him, the words nearly undid him. "Where's Mama?" Fred froze. His mind went blank, his chest tightening with the ache of 1,000 things he couldn't say. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking slightly, and wrote carefully, "Mama is away for a little while, but I am here." Kai studied the words, her fingers tracing over the ink as though trying to pull meaning from them. Then she wrote again, "Promise?" He met her gaze, his own eyes burning, and nodded. She seemed to accept it, setting the notepad aside before curling back into him. Fred held her close, resting his chin on her soft hair, the faint scent of her shampoo grounding him in the moment. Her breathing slowed, the rhythm of it steady and safe against him. He stayed like that long after her eyes had fluttered shut. When sleep finally claimed her, Fred looked around the dimly lit room, his gaze lingering on the shadows stretching across the walls. Anya's face filled his thoughts, Her eyes, full of fear and full of love, haunted him, and he could almost hear her voice even now, faint and trembling, calling his name as she was away. The image lodged deep in his chest, an open wound that refused to heal. "I'll get you out, Anya," he thought fiercely. "I'll bring you home." But the promise felt thin against the impossible weight of the world that had turned so cruelly against her. He brushed a trembling hand through Kai's hair, his fingertips gliding over the soft strands, as though trying to memorize their silk before the world could take it from him. She stirred faintly, her breath a quiet pulse against his shirt, small and steady, the sound of a life still untouched by the shadows that haunted his own. In that fragile rhythm, Fred found the last fragile thread of hope still binding him to something human. She was the part of Anya he could still hold, the echo of her warmth and laughter, distilled into one small, sleeping body. Through her, he remembered what it meant to keep going, to fight, to endure, to believe that there was still something left in this world worth saving. He reached for the remote, silencing the flicker and hum of the television, until only the room's quiet breathing remained. Then, slowly, he rose, gathering Kai into his arms. She was light, impossibly so, her small head resting against his shoulder, her hair brushing against his chin. Each step down the dim hallway felt deliberate, almost sacred. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath his feet sounded distant, reverent, as though the house itself were holding its breath while he carried something too precious to disturb. In the bedroom's half-light, he laid her gently upon the wide bed. The sheets sighed under her weight. For a moment he stood there, his breath shallow, watching the way her hand instinctively reached for him, curling around the fabric of his sleeve even in sleep. The gesture drew a quiet smile from him, one steeped in exhaustion and tenderness. He slipped off his shoes, careful not to break the fragile stillness that wrapped around them, and eased himself beside her. The mattress dipped as he lay down, his body curving toward hers. Almost immediately, she moved closer, her small frame tucking into him, her trust as unguarded as sunlight. His arms folded around her with the natural certainty of instinct, of blood recognizing blood. Her warmth pressed against his chest, steady and real, anchoring him to the present, to the soft exhale of her breath against his skin and the weight of her tiny hand against his heart. He closed his eyes, letting her breathing guide his own, slow and even. The chaos that had ruled his thoughts all day, the fear for Anya, and the memory of cold walls and closed doors, faded into a dull, harmless murmur. He allowed himself to stop fighting the noise in his head. There was nothing he could do but be here, in this small circle of warmth and silence. Kai shifted again, her face pressing deeper into his side, and Fred felt the ache in his chest soften. Her innocent trust, her helpless faith, was the only thing holding him together. He pressed his lips against her hair, breathing in its faint, familiar scent, the same one that had once lingered on Anya's pillow. "I will keep you safe," he promised silently. The words rose and fell in the dark like a prayer. Sleep came slowly, like a tide pulling him under. The tension in his body eased by degrees, replaced by a quiet that felt almost like peace. He opened his eyes once more to look at her, her small, perfect stillness, and then let them close, his arms tightening around her instinctively. Whatever waited beyond tomorrow, the danger, the questions, the desperate search, he would face it not as a man haunted by failure, but as her father, her protector, the one who would bring Anya home and rebuild what the world had tried to take. But as the darkness folded around them, and her small body radiated warmth against him, Fred let himself rest. In that quiet, in the fragile sanctuary of his daughter's sleep, he found the first faint shape of solace.